650 victims. A castle of screams. But was Elizabeth Báthory a serial killer, or the target of a massive royal conspiracy? To fully, truly, and comprehensively comprehend the dark, twisted genesis of the woman who would eventually be branded by the unforgiving and often sensationalized annals of history as the Blood Countess, one must first undertake the arduous, complex, and illuminating task of navigating the labyrinthine, interwoven, and often treacherous genealogy of the Báthory clan. A family whose influence over the principalities of Transylvania and the Kingdom of Hungary was as absolute as it was historically volatile. Elizabeth was not merely born into accidental wealth or passive unearned privilege. She was meticulously forged within the crucible of the Ext branch of the Báthory family, a lineage that had accumulated vast territorial estates, impregnable mountain fortresses, an immense political capital through centuries of relentless military prowess, strategic intermarriage, and ruthless maneuvering against rival houses like the Habsburgs. However, this aggressive, centuries-long strategy of consolidating feudal power through insular bloodlines came with a terrifying, unavoidable, biological cost, as generations of consanguinity intermarriage between cousins to keep land within the family had introduced a pervasive genetic instability that manifested in brilliance, erratic behavior, and in Elizabeth's specific case, likely severe, and degenerative neurological disorders that haunted her from the cradle to the grave. Born on August 7, 1560, at the family manor in Nyorbeider, she spent her formative years surrounded not by the comforts of a typical sheltered childhood, but by the grim, steel-clad realities of a region perpetually on a total war footing against the encroaching Ottoman Empire, witnessing a level of casual systemic brutality in daily life public executions, the display of severed heads on pikes, the whipping of serfs for minor infractions that normalized violence for the aristocracy to a degree that modern minds struggle to conceive. Contemporary historians and medical anthropologists now strongly suggest that the young countess suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, a serious, likely congenital neurological condition which, in the superstitious and medically primitive climate of the 16th century, was often misdiagnosed as demonic possession or a sign of an ungovernable, wicked temperament, caused by an imbalance of the humors blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These seizures, characterized by terrifying auras, violent convulsions, and total loss of conscious control, were treated not with compassionate, scientific medicine, but with a mixture of religious fear, mystic rituals, and painful exorcisms that reportedly involved rubbing the fresh, warm blood of non-suffering individuals onto the lips of the patient, arguably her very first psychological introduction to blood as a curative, vitalizing, and necessary agent for her own survival and stability. This medical context is crucial and often overlooked in favor of supernatural explanations. The falling sickness she likely endured would have subjected her to intense physical trauma and potentially aggressive treatments that could have desensitized a developing child to the concepts of pain, bodily suffering, and the violation of the human form. Furthermore, her upbringing was one of extreme unchecked privilege, where the peasantry were viewed as little more than livestock, biological property to be used, consumed, and discarded at will, a worldview that was rigidly reinforced by her family's absolute judicial authority, known in legal terms as the jus gladi, or the right of the sword, which gave them the divine and legal power of life and death over their subjects without external oversight. The duality of her existence, possessing the highest pedigree in the land, yet plagued by an internal physiological chaos, created a personality that was at once commanding and dangerously unstable, setting the stage for a life where her whims would eventually acknowledge no moral, religious, or legal boundary. We are dedicated to building a digital archive of human resilience, but these deep dives require immense resources. If you value this level of research, please like and subscribe. This tells the algorithm that deep-form history still matters in a world of fleeting content. Help us keep these legends alive. The trajectory of Elizabeth's life was irrevocably altered, hardened, and ultimately defined by her union with Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a marriage arranged, and she was a mere child of 10, consummated later in 1575, which was less a romantic endeavor and more a colossal geopolitical merger of two industrial-scale empires, tended to fortify the Hungarian border against the encroaching Ottoman Turks. Nadasdy was not a courtier of the silk slipper variety found in the western courts of Paris or London. He was a warrior of terrifying reputation. Known across Europe as the Black Knight of Hungary, or Black Bey, to his trembling enemies for his ruthless efficiency, immense physical strength, and tactical brilliance in the Long War or the 15 Years' War against the Ottoman Turks. Because her husband was perpetually on the battlefield, carving out a legacy in blood and iron, and leaving a trail of severed heads in his wake, Elizabeth was thrust into a role that few women of her era could comprehend, let alone execute with such iron-fisted capability. She became the de facto ruler of a vast network of estates, castles, and villages that stretched across the Kingdom of Hungary and present-day Slovakia. This was not merely a domestic role of household management or child-rearing, it was a position of supreme executive power where she managed complex logistics, defense strategies against Turkish raids, supply chains for the Royal Army, diplomatic correspondence, and the judicial administration of the local population. In the vacuum of her husband's absence, her authority was absolute. She was the judge, jury, and lord of the land, operating with an autonomy that was virtually unheard of for women in the strictly patriarchal structure of 16th century Europe. The sheer weight of this responsibility cannot be overstated. She was managing the defense of Siege Castle against potential siege while simultaneously overseeing the economic output of the region, ensuring the harvest was collected, taxes were paid, and order was maintained in a land ravaged by constant warfare, banditry, and the bitter, unrelenting cold of the Little Ice Age, which caused frequent famines and hardened the population to suffering. However, this profound isolation also meant that there was no one to check her darker, more sadistic impulses. While Nadasdy was undoubtedly a brutal man, he allegedly taught Elizabeth some of the more severe disciplinary techniques, such as covering a servant in honey to be stung by insects, a method used on Turkish prisoners of war. His presence would have at least provided a peer scrutiny. Without him, in the cold, wind-swept solitude of the castle, surrounded only by sycophants and servants who feared for their lives, Elizabeth's dominance ossified into a terrifying omnipotence. She was the law, and in the remote fortresses of the Carpathians, the law could be twisted into whatever shape the ruler desired. The descent from strict feudal discipline into outright recreational sadism was likely a gradual, insidious erosion of moral boundaries rather than a sudden psychotic break. Fueled by the immense stress of her position, the biological changes of her body, and a complete lack of accountability inherent in the class system of the time. In the context of the era, the physical punishment of servants was not only legal, it was an expected, divinely ordained duty of the aristocracy. To maintain order, and beatings were a commonplace, unremarkable method of correcting laziness, theft, or insubordination. However, within the thick, soundproof stone walls of Sigith, Sarvar, and Bekov, walls designed to withstand cannon fire and thus perfectly suited to stifle human screams, something darker and more malignant began to metastasize as the years of isolation wore on. The distinction between correction and torture began to blur. Driven perhaps by Elizabeth's volatile temper and chronic, blinding migraines, which she sought to relieve through the perverse catharsis of inflicting pain on others. A psychological transfer of agony. Whispers began to circulate among the local peasantry and castle staff that the Countess's reactions to minor infractions, a poorly stitched seam, a broken cup, a hesitant answer, were becoming grotesquely disproportionate to the offense. What started as slaps or the use of a switch escalated into the use of hot irons. Needles inserted under fingernails to cause maximum agony, and exposure to freezing water in the dead of winter, a method where victims were doused in water and left in the courtyard until they became human ice statues. A cruelty inspired by the harsh winter climate. These methods transformed the domestic sphere into a literal torture chamber, hidden behind the facade of nobility. The psychological environment of the castle became one of suffocating, constant terror, where the young serving girls lived on a knife edge of anxiety, knowing that the slightest error could result in permanent disfigurement or death. This was the trap of absolute power. As Elizabeth found that she could inflict these punishments without consequence, the threshold for her satisfaction moved ever higher. The castle became a hermetically sealed world where the norms of human decency were suspended, replaced by the arbitrary and cruel logic of a woman who viewed her servants not as humans but as sensory objects upon which she could project her own internal agony, boredom, and rage. If the years of her marriage were characterized by a simmering, sporadic cruelty, the death of Ferenc, Nadasti, in 1604 marked the removal of the final guardrail, plunging Elizabeth into a spiral of unchecked depravity and madness from which she would never return. As a widow, she was now the sole head of the household, answerable to no man and possessed of a fortune that rivaled the king's own, a combination that made her untouchable in her own eyes and arguably the most powerful woman in the region. It is during this period, from 1604 to 1610, that the allegations suggest her behavior shifted from severe discipline to ritualistic slaughter, without the distraction of managing her husband's military campaigns or the need to maintain a semblance of wifely decorum for his visits. Elizabeth's dark obsessions reportedly took center stage. The historical accounts and witness testimonies paint a picture of a woman who began to derive a distinct, visceral pleasure from the act of suffering itself, seeking out new and more inventive ways to torment her victims. The violence was no longer about correcting a servant's mistake. It was about the act of domination and the thrill of absolute control over life and death. The castle's hidden chambers became theaters of horror where the Countess, reportedly suffering from intensified seizures and bouts of menopausal rage, often misunderstood in that era as hysteria, would spend hours inflicting pain. This escalation also suggests a psychological decomposition. The stress of widowhood, the pressure of defending her estates from political vultures who saw a lone woman as easy prey, and her underlying neurological issues likely combined to shatter whatever empathy remained. She was no longer just a cruel mistress. She had become a predator within her own home, consuming the lives of those sworn to serve her, confident that her status as a Nadasti and a Báthory rendered her immune to the laws of God and men. However, a massacre on this industrial scale is rarely a solitary endeavor. Elizabeth Báthory did not operate in a vacuum, but was supported by a sinister coterie of enablers who served as the machinery of her madness. The investigation would later identify a tight-knit inner circle of servants, most notably her trusted elderly nurse, Ilona Jo, the major domo, Janos Fichko, the suspected witch, Dorothea Shantes, and the laundress Catalin Benachki, who were far more than mere bystanders. These individuals were instrumental in the procurement of victims and the execution of the Countess's sadistic whims, acting as extensions of her will. The dynamic between Elizabeth and her accomplices is a chilling study in the psychology of coercion and shared guilt. These servants, some of whom had been with her for years, were likely motivated by a complex mixture of terror, loyalty, and the perverse rewards that came with being in the predator's favor rather than being the prey. It is alleged that these older women, particularly Dorothea Shantes, introduced Elizabeth to the darker side of local folklore and occult practices, suggesting that the torture sessions were not merely for pleasure, but held a quasi-magical significance intended to cure the Countess's ailments or preserve her fading vitality. Fitzko, physically stronger, tasked with the grim labor of body disposal and the physical restraint of victims who fought back. Their complicity allowed the crimes to continue for years, as they created a buffer of silence around the Countess. intimidating witnesses and burying the dead in clandestine graves in the churchyard, the grain pits, or the forest. This network of abuse demonstrates that the horror of siege was systemic. It required a micro-society of willing executioners to function, all orbiting around the dark star of Elizabeth's authority, bound together by the blood they spilled. The turning point that finally pierced the veil of silence and forced the Kingdom of Hungary to act was a fatal, arrogant shift in Elizabeth's victimology, the transition from killing peasants to targeting the lesser nobility. For years, the deaths of peasant girls, daughters of serfs, blacksmiths, and farmers could be swept under the rug. In the rigid feudal hierarchy of the time, reinforced by the tripartite legal code of 1514, which codified the rights of nobles and the servitude of peasants. These lives were considered expendable property of the Lord, and their deaths were easily explained away as cholera plague or purely accidental. However, in 1609, driven by an insatiable need for new victims or perhaps a delusion that she was untouchable, Elizabeth opened a gyneceum, or a finishing school, within her castle, inviting the daughters of the gentry, the nannies, to learn courtly etiquette, domestic management, and social graces. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Unlike the peasantry, the lower nobility had political connections, families with standing, and the means to ask questions when their daughters ceased writing home or vanished without a trace. When these high-born girls began to die under mysterious circumstances, some reportedly thrown out of the castle walls or buried hastily with visible wounds, the excuse of illness no longer held water. The disappearance of a noblewoman was an attack on the class structure itself, a violation of the unspoken contract between the aristocracy. Rumors exploded across the region, not just of cruelty, but of murder. The cries of the grieving noble families reached the ears of the Palatine and the king, transforming what was previously a local rumor into a state-level scandal that could no longer be ignored or silenced by the formidable Báthory name. Yet, as with all things in the complex political landscape of the 17th century, Habsburg monarchy, the hand of justice, was heavily guided by the hand of political opportunism, raising the question of whether the investigation was motivated by morality or by the king's desperate financial ledger. King Matthias II of Hungary was in a precarious position. He owed an astronomical debt to the Nadasti Báthory estate, a sum so vast that it threatened the stability of the royal treasury incurred during the expensive and exhausting wars against the Ottomans. Elizabeth was not just a widow. She was one of the primary creditors of the crown, and her immense land holdings were a tantalizing prize for a monarch short on cash and long on enemies. By branding Elizabeth a heretic and a murderer, the crown stood to gain on two fronts: the potential confiscation of her lands, though this was legally complex due to family trusts, and the nullification of the royal debt. It was under this cloud of conflict of interest that the king ordered Georgi Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary and a former friend of Elizabeth's husband, to launch a formal investigation. Thurzo was placed in an impossible position, balancing his duty to the king, the demands of the angry nobility, and his intricate ties to the Báthory clan. He was arguably protecting the family name from total ruin by preventing a show trial. The investigation was undoubtedly aggressive, collecting hundreds of testimonies in record time, which suggests a predetermined outcome was desired. While the crimes were likely real and horrific, the speed and fervor of the legal proceedings point to a secondary agenda: the neutralization of a powerful female oligarch who controlled too much land and held too much leverage over the throne. The machinery of the state was not moving to save young girls. It was moving to save the king's bank account. The culmination of this political and criminal drama occurred on the freezing, snow-covered night of December 29, 1610, when Georgi Thurzo led a surprise raid on Szeged Castle, an event that would be immortalized in history. The Palatine and his men did not send a summons. They stormed the gates under the cover of darkness, anticipating resistance or perhaps fearing that evidence would be destroyed if they gave warning. What they reportedly found inside shattered any possibility of a cover-up. According to the letters and reports Thurzo sent to the king immediately after the raid, the investigators walked in on a scene of active carnage that defied belief. They discovered a dead girl in the main hall, her body drained of blood, another dying from severe torture, and several others locked in dungeons, beaten, starved, and freezing, but alive. The discovery of fresh bodies and dying victims provided the in flagrante delicto. Caught in the act, evidence that was necessary to bypass the usual legal protections afforded to a person of Elizabeth's rank. The raid was chaotic and brutal. The sudden intrusion of armed soldiers into the private sanctum of the Countess marked the instant collapse of her world. There was no time to clean the blood, no time to hide the instruments of torture, and no time to intimidate the witnesses. Elizabeth was placed under house arrest immediately, stripped of her authority in a single night as the machinery of the state, which she had so long relied upon for protection, finally turned its gears against her. Following the raid, the ensuing legal proceedings were characterized by a glaring judicial anomaly. While her accomplices were dragged before the court, Elizabeth Báthory was conspicuously absent, barred from speaking in her own defense. A trial was swiftly convened, and hundreds of witnesses ranging from local priests to castle servants and even a few survivors testified to a litany of horrors, detailing atrocities that stunned the court. They spoke of beatings, burnings, freezing water, and starvation, painting a portrait of a monster in human form. Yet the primary mastermind behind these crimes was never formally charged, never stood trial, and never had the opportunity to refute the testimony. This was a calculated political maneuver by Thurzo and the Báthory clan council, bringing a high-ranking noblewoman, a Báthory, to public trial for witchcraft and murder would have caused irreparable damage to the reputation of the Hungarian aristocracy, and potentially led to the crown's confiscation of all family lands, a precedent other nobles were desperate to avoid. If the king could seize the lands of a Báthory, he could seize theirs as well. By denying her a trial, they avoided a public verdict that could tarnish the entire lineage. Instead, they opted for a solution that effectively silenced her while shielding the family fortune from the king's grasp. Elizabeth was condemned by the weight of the evidence against her servants. Her guilt was treated as absolute, and her voice was extinguished by the very class system that had once empowered her, while the Countess was shielded from the executioner's blade by her noble crest. No such mercy was extended to her servants, who bore the full brunt of the kingdom's wrath in a spectacle of swift and barbaric justice. The trial of Ilona Jodoracha Shantes and Janos Fichko was a formality intended to close the case publicly and provide a scapegoat for the collective horror of the community. The sentences handed down were designed not just to punish, but to obliterate. The fingers of the female accomplices, which the court deemed the instruments used to torture the girls, were ripped from their hands with red-hot pincers before they were thrown onto pyres to be burned alive. Fichko, likely due to his gender or perhaps a minor mercy for cooperation, was beheaded before being burned. These executions were carried out publicly, serving as a gruesome theater to satisfy the bloodlust of the populace and to signal that justice had been done. However, the disparity in punishment, the servants burned to ash while the mistress remained alive in her castle, highlighted the stark hypocrisy of the era. The system was willing to destroy the hands that held the whip, but it could not bring itself to destroy the mind that commanded them. The gruesome deaths of her inner circle served to hermetically seal the scandal, burying the secrets of Sigit in the ashes of the pyre, leaving Elizabeth alone in the wreckage of her former life. Too powerful to execute, but too dangerous to release, Elizabeth Báthory faced a punishment that was unique in the annals of history. A sentence of living burial within the very walls that had witnessed her crimes. The family council and the Palatine agreed that she would be imprisoned for the remainder of her natural life in Sigit Castle. This was not a standard house arrest. It was a total erasure from the world. Masons were brought in to brick up the windows and doors of her suite of rooms, leaving only small slits open for the passage of food and the ventilation of air. She was effectively entombed while still breathing, condemned to exist in a twilight state of solitary confinement. The psychological impact of this sentence is unimaginable. She was trapped in the same physical space where she had allegedly tortured so many, surrounded by the silence of the stone and the memories of her past power. She was cut off from all communication with her children, her friends, and the outside world. The vibrant, powerful magnate who had ruled over vast territories was reduced to a ghost haunting her own home. Stripped of every luxury, every distraction, and every human connection. This stone coffin was the ultimate compromise of the nobility. It removed the threat she posed and punished her severely, yet avoided the sacrilege of shedding noble blood. For 4 long years, the once mighty countess existed in this suffocating darkness, a period about which history remains largely silent, save for the fact that she refused to repent. There are no records of her confessing her sins or seeking absolution. Instead, it appears she maintained her innocence or perhaps her arrogance until the very end. On August 21, 1614, the guard bringing her daily meal found no response from the darkness beyond the slit. When the walls were breached, Elizabeth Báthory was found dead, lying face down on the floor. She was 54 years old. Her death marked the unceremonious end of the Nadasti Báthory dominance in the region. A quiet anticlimax to a life of thunderous violence. She was initially buried in the church at Cg, but the local outcry from the villagers who reviled her as a monster forced her body to be moved to the family crypt in Ext, her birthplace. There were no great eulogies, no state funerals. She passed from a living imprisonment into the finality of death, leaving behind a legacy that would almost immediately begin to twist and mutate. The silence she left behind was quickly filled by the whispers of the locals, stories that would grow in the telling, transforming the historical Elizabeth into a creature of myth, while the true human tragedy of her victims faded into the background. It is in the centuries following her death that the history of Elizabeth Báthory was almost completely consumed by the legend of the Blood Countess. A transformation driven by Gothic imagination rather than historical fact. The most enduring and horrific image associated with her, that she bathed in the blood of virgins to retain her eternal youth, is, according to all credible modern scholarship, a complete fabrication. This specific detail was never mentioned in the original trial transcripts, the witness testimonies, or the letters of the investigators. It was not until more than a century later, in 1729, that the Jesuit scholar Laszlo Tarocci recorded this detail in his History of Hungary, likely blending the Báthory story with existing folklore about witches and vampires. From there, the story took on a life of its own, becoming a staple of horror literature and eventually cementing itself in the global consciousness. The idea of the bloodbath transformed a brutal serial killer into a supernatural villain, a vanity-obsessed monster that fit perfectly into the Gothic sensibilities of later eras. This mythologizing has done a disservice to history. It distracts from the very real, very human suffering she inflicted. The truth was likely far more banal and disturbing. She did not kill for beauty or magic. She killed because she enjoyed the power of inflicting pain. The bloodbath is a lie that allows us to distance ourselves from the reality of her sadism, turning her into a caricature rather than a human being capable of immense evil. In the modern era, a new wave of historical revisionism has sought to re-examine the case of Elizabeth Báthory, asking whether she was indeed the world's most prolific female serial killer or the victim of a sophisticated political coup. Some historians argue that the lack of physical evidence presented at a formal trial, combined with the massive financial incentives for King Matthias and the political maneuvering of the Thurzo family, points to a conspiracy. They suggest that while Elizabeth may have been harsh, typical of her class, the scale of her crimes was grossly exaggerated to justify the seizure of her property. This theory posits that she was a strong, independent woman in a misogynistic era who was targeted because she refused to remarry and relinquish control of her estates. While this perspective offers a compelling counter-narrative that fits with our understanding of gender politics in the 17th century, it struggles to explain the sheer volume of witness testimonies and the reported discovery of bodies during the raid. The truth likely lies somewhere in the gray zone. Elizabeth was almost certainly a sadistic killer who tortured her servants. But her downfall was accelerated and weaponized by men who saw her crimes not just as a moral outrage, but as a convenient opportunity to destroy a political rival and erase a royal debt. Regardless of where the absolute truth lies between the monster and the victim, the name Báthory continues to haunt our collective imagination, serving as a dark icon of unchecked power and the corruption of the aristocracy. Her story has transcended the dry pages of history books to become a cautionary tale about the absolute corruption that absolute power brings. She represents the ultimate nightmare of the feudal system. The realization that those appointed to protect and rule could turn upon their subjects with predatory intent. Today she stands alongside Vlad the Impaler as a figure who occupies the liminal space between history and horror. A reminder that the scariest monsters are not supernatural beasts, but human beings stripped of empathy and given unlimited authority. Whether she was a demon in human skin or a convenient scapegoat for a bankrupt kingdom, Elizabeth Báthory remains a testament to the fact that history is often written by the victors who have the power to bury not just the bodies, but the truth itself, leaving us to sift through the centuries of rumor and legend to find the woman beneath the myth.